Thanks, David, and welcome everyone here tonight. I see we have 15 participants. Um, Usually my experience is hosting these types of conversations in a small group setting that's both very conversational and personal and intimate. So there's something sort of strange about having these conversations, or not even really a conversation. I'm sort of lecturing at you for 40 minutes, and I know you are 15 people, but I don't know who you are. So this is a very interesting experience, and one that actually fits really well into the topic that we're going to discuss tonight. Um, so back in December and January, David and I are friends. He invited me to think of something I could share with you guys tonight, and I got excited about sharing some thoughts about technology. I've spent quite a bit of time in the last few years thinking about technology, reading both sort of high-level philosophy as well as historic and practical examples of alternative technology movements. And I'm really, really interested to look at technology not just from like a practical, hard, scientific perspective, but think about it through like a practical community perspective. What is the effects of technology on our lives together? But as I begin tonight, I'd like to take us through a couple different thought experiments, if you will. And I want to begin with what church has looked like for a lot of us in the last couple months. There we go. This is probably my favorite COVID meme of the last couple months. As people all over the world, many Christians have been gathering over Zoom on Sundays to worship. And as we celebrated Easter recently, this was sort of the joke that was making its way through social media. Here's Jesus having the Last Supper with his friends. But as someone who's interested in technology, for me, what was most interesting about the switch over to Zoom because of COVID was actually the lack of reflection on it. How easily and how thoughtlessly most people jumped to worshiping over Zoom. Now, I don't have a problem with Zoom. I've used Zoom for presentations like this, and I've attended a couple church services through Zoom. But what was really surprising to me was just the total lack of reflection. See, with some exceptions, most people in our faith communities thought very little, if at all, about the transition from gathering in person to gathering over Zoom. Now, you have a couple people who are posting reflections on, what does it mean to practice maybe communion over Zoom? Are we allowed to do that? Does that make sense? But those are the exceptions. Most people just automatically kind of leapt into meeting on Zoom. In fact, in my own experience, I'm part of a small group, and our small group almost immediately began meeting on Sundays over Zoom. And I didn't take part in the first couple sessions, and I eventually took part again. But part of my concern was, like, I'll use Zoom if I have to, but it does not feel the same in terms of personal connection. But anyways, there's this thing that I noticed. There was such a poverty of reflection, almost no thought about transitioning from gathering into person to gathering over Zoom. It was like almost as if nothing had happened. So as I was thinking about this, I sort of designed an experiment for us. So all of you 15 or so who are listening, I hope you would join with me in this experiment. It's an imaginary experiment about other technologies besides Zoom. Imagine that you were alive sometime during the past 200 years when a now very prevalent new technology was first introduced to the public. I'm going to give you 4 examples of different technologies that were invented, and I want you to ask yourself, for each technology, hypothetically, what would I be thinking when adopting this technology? Cars. Cars were invented, I don't know exactly, sometime between 1900 and 1920. What would you be thinking when you first bought a car, drove in a car, got a car? Telephones. Televisions. And finally, computers. I'll give you about 20 seconds to think about what your attitudes would be like when each of these new technologies were first introduced. Now for part 2 of the experiment. This time, I want you to imagine specifically the people who are slow to adopt, who are cautious, or who even reject technology. Think about the people who are cautious about cars, slow to adopt telephones, or even rejecting of television or computers. Think about those people. Now think, are they a majority or a minority of people? What kind of people are these rejectors of technology? What are they like? What are their personalities like? What's their character? What are their reasons for being cautious or for rejecting the technology? You don't have to have this exactly, but what comes to mind? If you imagine these people, what are their reasons for being cautious? And finally, is their critique more rational or more reactionary? I'll give you another 20 seconds just to think about these questions as I pour myself a coffee, decaf. I'm going to hazard a guess here. These are things I thought about, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you would have thought similar things. When thinking about cars, telephones, TV, or computers, I think most people would have thought things like this. First of all, it's new, and there's something exciting about newness. Second of all, it seems easy, or it seems like life is getting easier. There may have been difficulty or stress or strain to do whatever cars, TV, and computers do now, but now things are easier. It's not only new, it's easier. Speed. The one thing about cars, telephone, TV, and computers is they all add speed. Speed of getting from one place to another, speed about being able to talk to someone, speed about delivering information. And finally, freedom. There's a certain air of freedom to cars, telephone, TV, and computers. It's not all of freedom, but there is a level of liberation or choice involved in each of these 4 technologies. And I think probably, even though I read a lot of philosophy critical of technology, I would have thought of all of these 4 things when the technologies were first introduced. Now let's think about the cautious people. What are they like? What about the cautious, slow, and rejecting? First of all, I think many of us would see them as a minority. As we look back upon these 4 technologies that I talked about today, the people who would be slow at adopting them or who would reject them are not the majority of people. They're a minority. What are these people like? Words that might come to mind are they're cranks, they're suspicious, cynical, maybe old. There's a weird connection between ageism and anti-technology too. What are their reasons? And I think this is significant. Whatever the reasons people may have about rejecting technology, they all seem idiosyncratic. What I mean by that is the reasons people give aren't applicable to everyone. They're highly personal, individualized reasons for rejecting technology. This minority group of people who go against the new technology or who are cautious about it, they're not giving rational reasons applicable to everyone. Their reasons are highly idiosyncratic, which is related to the fourth element, which is they're more reactionary than rational. They're not really thinking things through. They're just reacting to newness. So in this experiment, I'm not doing a sociological study, and I'm not suggesting the attitudes are right. I'm just saying a lot of us can understand or imagine what it was like when new technology was introduced and how people reacted to it. Now, based on all this, let's go back to our question. Zoom. Imagine 5 months from now at a church AGM, someone stands up and questions whether we should have been worshiping with Zoom at all. What do you think the reaction of your church would be? Now, the reactions may have been various, but likely the reaction would be incredulity. Really? They're really asking about this? I guess we have to love them because, we're a church, but really? Cue eye rolls. So once again, I have to ask, why is this the case? Why is caution or criticism about technology a minority view? And why do most people think very little, if at all, about technology, especially in this case, the transition from gathering in person to gathering over Zoom? My thesis here is it's because of how we interpret technology. It's what we have allowed technology to symbolize. Or another way to put it, what have we allowed technology to mean? I think the reason we don't question it is actually on a deeper symbolic or almost mythical level. We've made technology mean something more than what it is. And what I want to suggest to you tonight, and this is a suggestion or an argument, feel free to push back in the Q&A at the end. I want to say we've made technology the symbol of progress. What I mean by that is new technology is not just new technology. In our wider shared culture, new technology has become a sign that things are getting better. So when a new iPhone comes out, when a new social media platform comes out, when electric vehicles come out, whatever the new technology is, it's never just the new technology that's at stake. The new technology is always read as a sign that things are getting better. And furthermore, or as part of this, there's this assumption that new technology is always good and better. And as I was reflecting on technology as a symbol of progress, I sort of recognized that there are logical equivocations that people make about technology. And I'm going to go through them on the next slide. And I just want you to bear in mind, these are my observations. But I think if you went to the average person in the street, I think they would largely kind of agree with these equivocations. And I think that's what makes them powerful. What I'm about to suggest to you isn't rationally thought out, but it's subconsciously held. The equivocations behind the symbol. So when people don't question new technology, that's seen as equivalent to accepting it. And accepting new technology is often seen as the same thing as accepting technology. And accepting technology is, of course, accepting science. And accepting science is, of course, accepting reason or being reasonable. On the other hand, the alternative to these equivocations, if you question new technology, you must be not accepting of it. And if you don't accept new technology, you must not accept technology in general. And if you don't accept technology in general, you must not accept science. And if you don't accept science, you must be irrational. So these sort of bundled rationality is what's behind technology as a symbol of progress. Again, this isn't something a scientific, social scientific study has proven. This is just, I think, generally in our culture, the assumptions people make. Being pro-technology means being pro-science, means being pro-reason. And I want to kind of dig at that tonight and question it, dig into it. I've entitled my talk tonight, Technology, Progress, or Prudence? And I want to make a claim. I want to make a claim about technology. This is the key thesis for what I want to talk about tonight. That new technology needs to be up for debate in our communities, whether it's a church community, a city, or even a society. And that careful evaluation should replace assumptions that new technology is always good or better. So I'm saying two things. First, new technology needs to be questioned, which doesn't mean it's bad. I'm just saying let's question it first. Maybe it ends up being good. And second of all, that this questioning, this careful judgment and evaluation should replace the assumptions that many in our culture share, that new technology is always good and better. Thus, instead of new technology being a sign that things are getting better, it should be a sign of our need to be vigilant in discernment. This is progress versus prudence. What is technology a sign of? So in order to make this argument tonight, I first want to start out by talking about assumptions and alternatives. So I've picked 7 assumptions about technology, and this comes from wide reading in philosophy and sociology around technology, as well as personal observation. And for each of these 7 assumptions, I want to present an alternative assumption that I think actually corresponds better with the evidence and give examples. After talking about these 7 assumptions, I want to talk about 3 modern precedents. I want to talk about 3 groups of people that have questioned technology as progress and have charted a different path. I don't want to be on the level of philosophy all night tonight. I want to actually give you real-life examples of communities that have questioned and come up with alternative ways of relating to technology. After that, I want to give you 3 reasons why this matters to me really deeply. This isn't just sort of a philosophical game for me, although it is a game in the sense that it's kind of interesting and engaging, but it's related to deeply held convictions of mine, convictions that are also related to my faith. Near the end, I want to talk about some practices, personal things that we can do, or community practices that we can relate to technology. The 3 groups that I present in modern precedents, we can't exactly imitate or copy in our culture, but I want to talk about different things that we can do personally and as communities where we can relate to technology in a more healthy way. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts about how prudence is greater than progress. So let's start with assumptions. Assumption and alternative number 1. A common assumption in our culture is that the tool is never the problem. The problem is how the tool is being used. I think out of everything I talk about tonight, this is probably the most important thing. Whenever people acknowledge that, oh yes, like a tool or a piece of technology was had some sort of destructive impact, the response is usually, but it's not actually the technology itself. It's how the tool was being used. I mean, a very famous and somewhat political example of this is the guns don't kill people, people kill people kind of thing. I'm not going to get into that tonight. That might be a little bit of a bunny trail sidetrack kind of thing. But whatever the case is, whenever critiques of technology are brought up, the most common response is it's not the tool, it's how the tool is being used. And I want to suggest as an alternative, an alternative assumption should be that sometimes the problem is the tool itself because potential or probable uses are problematic. So sometimes it's not just the use of the tool, it's the nature of the tool itself. So some key distinctions here. When I talk about the nature of the tool, I mean two things, and this is really important. First, each tool has a range of potential uses. You can't use a tool for everything, right? I can't fly using a bicycle, but every tool has a range of potential uses. And it's key to understand that one bad use doesn't negate all its potential good uses. On the other hand, within the range of potential uses, each tool has a tendency or a bias towards certain use. I have a picture of a screwdriver right here, and I think this is a practical example. You can use a screwdriver for many things. I've used a screwdriver when I've had to hammer something in before, just because I didn't have a hammer. You can use it that way, but the tendency or the bias of a screwdriver is to screw something in. That's what it's most naturally doing. Let me use maybe a more controversial example. Before I do that, I want to talk about another key distinction, which is culture. So we have the use of the tool, the nature of the tool, and then human culture. So human communities can maintain taboos or norms around technologies. So if they understand that a technology can be poorly used, they can resist that by shaming that use. I have an example here of a TV cupboards. My grandparents come from a church where TV use is frowned upon. So when they got a TV, my grandfather built a cupboard so he could close the doors whenever his brothers came over, so they didn't really realize that he had a TV. This is an example of a culture around technology. We'll get into these distinctions as we go along. So in terms of the nature of a tool, the range of possible uses as well as the biases or tendencies of a tool, I want to talk about TV. TV is a really great example of this. Since the 1950s, when television was first introduced, reams and reams, books and books, papers and papers have been written about toxic television shows, television programming that is not healthy for people. But clearly that is a use of technology. There might be bad shows, but that doesn't condemn TV itself. That just condemns how TV is being used, for example. But other writers have noticed television also has a tendency. That is, there are certain shows that TV more likely will allow than others. To give you an example of this, there's the phrase talking heads. It's sometimes a pejorative phrase for interview shows where for extended periods of time, the television camera is on one person talking for 15 minutes about something that's kind of boring. And then there's an exchange with an interviewer or so forth. The phrase talking head show shows that producers of television understand that interview style doesn't really work with the medium. I mean, there are interview shows and they're high quality sometimes, but the reality is TV doesn't tend towards that. In a lot of countries, other types of shows that have rapid image movement, for example, are more likely to be seen. To use another example, in real life, I can easily sit by a fire and be engaged by a real-life fire. I don't know if you've ever seen those Yule logs on television, but they're pretty much the most boring, unengaging thing you can see because it's not natural for the medium of television to show the same image of something basically still, that stays the same for long periods of time. It's just not in the nature of the medium. So here's an example, television, of there's a range of uses in TV, but TV also tends towards a certain type of show or type of product. In the 1980s, Neil Postman wrote a book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he makes this basic argument that TV just can't hold as a technology intense, intellectual, nuanced discourse. It's not that people producing television shows are stupid, or even viewers of television shows are naturally stupid. It's just that the medium isn't conducive for that. And he argued that has negative effects on society. But his main argument was, like, we can't just think about the programs on TV, but recognize that TV has a bias towards certain kinds of programs. Another example often used by philosophers of technology is a nuclear power plant. A nuclear power plant, they say, has a tendency towards elite control. And what they mean by this is, in order to produce nuclear power in a somewhat safe way, you need both scientific and military elites. So you need people who are highly trained using the materials to keep it safe. And you need military elites, essentially, to guard the nuclear power from being taken by other enemy countries or terrorists or that kind of thing. Unlike a solar panel, for example, which a few neighbors can put up in the backyard, nuclear power is not conducive to individual or community control, individual or community use. Nuclear power fits well into a more centralized bureaucratic state. Now, you might think, well, I'm okay with a centralized bureaucratic state if it means we can have energy. Okay, that's one thing. But it's about recognizing the tendency towards a certain kind of social arrangement when it comes to nuclear power as a technology. Just two examples. Assumption and alternative number 2. There's often this easy, uncritical assumption that something being newer and easier automatically makes it good. And I want to suggest to you that actually the opposite is the case. Other standards can outweigh the newer and the easier. Costs can be greater than benefits. Even outside of technology, it should go without saying that new and easy aren't necessarily good and true. So I want to use the example of a bicycle here. And this is just a quick example. You can often get to work easier with a car if your work is far away. But often with a bike, even though it might take physically more energy and it might take more time, what's interesting to notice is there's a variety of US companies now that are actually beginning to pay people to bike to work. And the reason they do so is they found people who bike to work actually have less hospital visits, and so it's cheaper on company health insurance plans if people bike to work rather than drive. So here's an example where the standard of maybe physically easier and practically faster isn't the only standard that we should use to judge technology. Now, I'm not passing condemnation or judgment on people who drive to work, but I'm just questioning maybe the simplicity of standards we might use when it comes to easier or faster. Another assumption is that any downsides to new technologies are minor. They're either insubstantial or easily fixable. If people come to the place where they recognize actually there are downsides to technology, whether those downsides are financial cost or environmental impact, usually they try to dismiss it, saying, okay, yeah, there is that downside, but A, it's either not that bad, or B, if it is bad, we can fix it quite easily. Kind of an optimistic bias. An alternative assumption is that sometimes downsides are significant, and significant enough to warrant rejecting the technology. This is a computer from the 1990s. I don't quite remember this actually, but I got this picture off Wikipedia. I want to talk to you about an essay I really love by Wendell Berry, written in the mid-90s, called Why I Won't Buy a Computer. In this essay, Wendell Berry, who is a farmer and a writer from Kentucky, talks about how many of his friends and colleagues were urging him to purchase a computer when personal computers were first becoming widely available. In this essay, written originally for Harper's Magazine, he talks about two main reasons why he rejects using the computer. The first reason is related to power. He says that in his area of Kentucky, the electricity produced comes from mountaintop removal coal. And as an environmentalist, he can't, in good conscience, use that electricity. He admits that there are parts of his life where he does use electricity for necessity. But, he says, if I don't have to, why would I? Now that might be a more clear example. The second reason he gives for rejecting technology is fascinating. He says everyone is urging him to use the personal computer because he can write faster. And he's quite clear in the essay, writing faster isn't my goal. My goal is writing better and more clearly. And in a very beautiful prose for about 3 pages, he describes how using a pencil and paper actually enables his craft, enables him to do the work of a writer better. And he says, if people can show me that using a computer actually makes my writing better, then I might consider it. But so far, people are talking about this simplistic standard of faster, when in my judgment, there are reasons why going slowly using pen and paper actually make me a better writer. So I think this is a really good example that there can be downsides to technology, whether environmental or in terms of human art and craft, that I think are important to consider. Some more on assumptions 2 and 3. The question is, how do we do a full accounting of new technology? And by full accounting, I mean, how do we look at both the costs and the benefits of technology? Often in our culture, it's really only the benefits that are focused on. There's no billion-dollar marketing campaign that talks about the downsides of getting a new iPhone or the downsides of buying that new car. But what I'm talking about tonight is that we as communities need to look at both the costs and the benefits. And it may be that the benefits outweigh the costs, but we should look at both. And part of looking at the costs and benefits means paying attention to the hidden costs. Some of these costs aren't quite out front. This is the thing I found really fascinating about reading Berry's essay that I mentioned before. The idea that writing on a computer could actually make me a worse writer is not something I had thought about. I grew up with personal computers. I used computers in grade school. The idea that they could affect my writing quality was something I hadn't thought of before. It was a hidden dimension to the technology. And as part of this, we're not just talking about monetary costs. We're talking about ecological ones, political ones, and cultural ones. How do we fully account for these things? Assumption and alternative number 4. There's an assumption that questioning technology is irrational. I think, again, I always imagine if I were Jimmy Kimmel or something like that, going out on the street, talking to ordinary people, and I asked them, what do you think about people who question technology? I think most responses would be like, well, they're cranks, they're irrational, they're not thinking straight, or something like that. The alternative assumption I want to give tonight is that never or only rarely questioning technology is rational. And a related assumption and alternative The assumption that innovation is innocent until proven guilty. The alternative is that innovation should be considered guilty until proven innocent. Assumptions 4 and 5 go together, so I want to explore them together. The key question is who has the work? Who has to do the work of making the argument? Where does the burden of proof lie? Does the argument belong, or does the burden of proof belong to the innovators? Or does it belong to those who would reject technology? Since we assume that innovation means that you're rational and that questioning technology has placed the burden of proof on the technologically skeptical. I'm not sure about the people who are here tonight, but I'm pretty sure most people who I would talk to about these issues would give the burden of proof to me. If I'm the one questioning technology, I have to develop a really, 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 really good argument against it. There's this innocent until proven guilty assumption with technology that I really want to question tonight, and I think it would be really valuable for us to question that as a wider culture. I want to talk about predicting the telephone. So when I talk about innovation is innocent until proven guilty, the interesting thing about that is that's a wider assumption in our culture, but not necessarily the assumption made by people who invent these new technologies. There was a fascinating series of studies done, I think, in the 1980s at MIT. Sorry, I have a book here and I want to quote it. And in this study, they looked at various technologies and how experts and their inventors predicted the long-term consequences of these studies. And I want to talk about one study in particular. In Forecasting the Telephone by Ithiel de Solopoul, the authors combined 300 predictions made by the telephone by business sources, scientists, and journalists in the early parts of the 20th century. Among some of their predictions are these. First of all, the telephone will become pervasive. Everybody will use it. Secondly, telephone conversations will be recorded, and this will probably be a civil liberties issue. Next, the telephone will aid industrial and corporate centralization, since management at a distance will now become possible. And this one's interesting. The television will foster the growth of downtown areas, creating suburbs and grow and advance the growth of skyscrapers. The reason given for this was that without the telephone, businesses would not occupy skyscrapers because it would require too many messages to be carried by hand up and down elevators, and that would be inconvenient. My point in reading these predictions is to note how the people inventing these new technologies often are very aware of long-term consequences of them and predict them with somewhat good accuracy, even if those consequences are negative to society. But most of society does not have the collective deliberative process to judge the new technologies. We're just sold the technologies. We are told about the good things that they can give us, but we aren't given the full picture. We have an innocent until proven guilty culture when it comes to technology, and I don't think this is helpful. Assumption and alternative 6. There's an assumption that personal experience is central to judging technology. So when I use something like my cell phone or my computer or a light switch or whatever, what matters most in determining whether the technology is good is how I personally experience it. But I want to argue that personal experience is potentially deceiving. The question is not whether you benefit. The question is, from this technology, who benefits most and to what end? And for this, I want to talk about computers. So when I think about my own personal experience with computers, it's largely good. Maybe the only negative aspect of using a computer is sometimes I use it for too long. Computers allow me to keep contact with people. They allow me to do things like this presentation tonight. They allow me to learn lots of things. But there's a great number of people who in the 1980s and 1990s were concerned about computers because they felt what it would do is that it would centralize power. They felt large corporations and large governments would use computers to gain more and more power from themselves, gather it up for themselves to the detriment of other people. Essentially, no matter what power the computer gave me personally, the computer gave governments or corporations disproportionately way more power. Anti-globalization activists in the 1990s, for example, argued that it was the personal computer or computer networks that actually made globalization possible. Without computers, the type of information and communication flows necessary for a multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation to exist, it just couldn't exist because the technology wouldn't allow it to exist across borders. But now with the internet and television, the internet and computers, this power is possible. I've even had personal conversations with executive directors of nonprofits who have told me that the type of regulation and control that governments require in terms of like reporting on metrics and numbers for government grants, for example, is much higher now than ever was in the late 80s or early 1990s. And the reason is the computer. The computer allows the government to potentially gain so much more information, and the government uses that. Now, again, you can have a choice. Maybe you think that concentration of power is a good thing, and you have an argument for that. I'm not saying, my argument isn't whether it's a good thing or not. My argument is that it is a thing. It is a thing that certain technologies actually concentrate power in society, and that we should really think about that when evaluating technology. Maybe it's not good that computers give so much power to some and the rest of us only get a little bit of power. Maybe we should think about that. The final assumption and alternative I want to talk about tonight is simply this. The first assumption is that good is good always and everywhere. With this assumption, we think that a technology that might be good for me or good for us is therefore good for everyone, everywhere, all the time. What I want to suggest instead, in line with this concept of prudence, is that application is the most important work. If we're really thinking about whether technology is a good or not, we have to admit that context matters a whole lot. A simple example that I've given about this before, I live and work in downtown Kitchener, and I do not own a car. In the context of my life, I don't need it. It would be superfluous, it would cost me more money, and I wouldn't really get a lot of benefit from it. On the other hand, when I was growing up, I grew up in the country, and the only job my mother could get was in the city. She needed a car. Otherwise, she couldn't work. Otherwise, she couldn't feed her family. And so when I talk about application as the most important work, I recognize that we're not talking about big rules about allowing this technology or not allowing this technology. What we're talking about is the need to develop wisdom in how we relate to technology. Recognizing in one's case, a car would be unnecessary and probably a burden. And on the other hand, a car was actually quite helpful. I want to move on to talk about precedents. Three groups that in the last 200 years have actually took a stand and developed an alternative relationship to technology. I don't want to remain at the level of philosophy, although that's really interesting. I want to give three real-life, practical, historical examples of relating to technology differently. The first is the Luddites. I love the Luddites. And what I find fascinating is that most people think Luddite is an insult. And I would venture to guess that if most people think Luddite, for the people who think Luddite is an insult, if you actually sat them down and explained to them who the Luddites were, why they did what they did, people would be like, oh, that's completely rational. That makes a lot of sense, even if they might disagree with the means used. The Luddites were a group of English textile craftsmen in the early 1800s, just around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. These were tradespeople, historic craftsmen, who had developed livelihood and skill around clothing manufacturing. And at the time, new machines, large automated looms, were being developed, and factories were being built all over the lowlands in England. And what these factories were doing is, A, they were putting a ton of people out of work. So all these people were losing their livelihoods because these machines were replacing the jobs. But on the other hand, it wasn't just livelihoods that mattered. What these looms did is they reduced workers to use a common phrase, a mere cog in the machine. There was nothing intrinsically human or artistic or requiring skill involved in the new loom machines. People became mere machine minders. And so the Luddites, in a very illegal manner, began going out at night, breaking into the factories and smashing these machines. These machines were a threat to their livelihood and a threat to the dignity and integrity of their craft. Eventually, the British government got so afraid of the Luddites, even though the Luddites harmed no person, they were just smashing machines. The British sent the army in. In fact, it was the largest internal military operation in British history. The army they sent to crush the Luddites was actually, at some points, the same size as the army that was battling Napoleon. And the Luddites were crushed. They were defeated by superior military might, and the machine won. Now, what I think is really fascinating about the Luddites is they provide a clear reasons why they were rejecting the technology. The technology is putting them out of work, and the technology was killing a traditional craft. To me, these are two valuable things. Nowadays, we often talk about, or there's a common conversation in our culture about guaranteed annual income. And what I find absolutely fascinating about this conversation is that guaranteed annual income is seen as a response to automation. So new technology is putting people out of work, so let's pay people so they don't lose their livelihoods. Never is there any suggestion, well, what if people want these jobs? Like, surely it's plausible to imagine they desire to be in these jobs. Why not give them the choice? Why not put the choice of technology in their hands? It's just the thought. I'm sure it will get no political traction whatsoever. But it's interesting to think about nonetheless. Anyways, Luddites, not an insult. Heroes. Although I don't agree with smashing machines, but that's a topic for later. The Amish. This is kind of a big can of worms. There's a lot of depth in history and culture I can go into here, which I just don't have time for. But I want to talk about some of the choices the Amish make around technology and why they make it. The Amish don't have sort of a modern deliberative culture. They make decisions in a way that's more in line with traditional folk cultures, but there is a rationality. There's reasonableness to their technology choices. And I just want to use two examples. So often in their farming technology, the Amish are perceived as rejecting all technology, which isn't true. There's a lot of modern farming technology that the Amish, in fact, do use. But one of the most fascinating criteria the Amish use is neighborliness when choosing a technology. For example, in the 1950s, new threshing machines were created. Now, beforehand, whenever a farmer had to thresh some wheat, I believe, he would have to get his neighbors together, and it would have to be a neighborly task. But what this new threshing technology did is it enabled a farmer to do it without help. And the Amish bishops got together, and they decided, in order to maintain our community, we need to need each other. If we become too independent, we'll lose our sense of community. So they actually banned these threshing machines because they thought neighborliness is so important, we got to protect it by banning this piece of technology. Another example is the use of horse and buggies, and there's a variety of reasons and history behind that, or sorry, not horse and buggies, farming with horses rather than tractors. A lot of Amish communities will say one of the reasons they choose to farm with horses rather than tractors is horses can only go so far in a day. There's only a certain amount of acreage that you can plausibly plow using a horse versus a tractor, which would be 10 times the amount of acreage. And for the Amish, there's something important about that sense of limits. It limits, for example, an individual father's ability to go farm, but then they have to come in at a certain time because the horse gets tired, and so then their time with their family is protected. On the other hand, it also resists any particular Amishman getting too greedy. There's a verse in the Bible, that in the book of Isaiah actually, that says, "Woe to you who add farm unto farm and house unto house until there's no one left for you in the land." The Amish sometimes quote this and say this is one of the reasons why we use horses rather than tractors. It limits the amount of land any one farmer can farm, and so in Amish country there are 10 times as many farmers as in non-Amish countries by necessity of their technology choice. And the amount of farmers also means a larger farming community. So that's another example of a group that has related to technology in a different way. I just want to stop here and say, at the very beginning, I talked about this close equivocation between being pro-technology and being rational. Often the Amish are looked down upon as people who are maybe quote-unquote culturally backward or irrational and unthinking. And I think these are really harmful stereotypes, for the people themselves, but also harmful because it doesn't allow our wider culture to understand actually the rationality behind Amish technology choices. So whether Luddites or Amish, what can be a slur of a word is actually something quite positive. Finally, I want to talk about something quite different, actually. The Intermediate Technology Development Group, which is now called Practical Action. And on your screen here is a picture of E.F. Schumacher, the renegade British economist, author of Small is Beautiful, and one of the founders of Intermediate Technology Development Group. So just very quickly, when it was founded in London, England in the 1960s, the Intermediate Technology Development Group saw a big problem in how development work was being done. They saw that essentially American and Western European groups were taking technology from the West and just plopping them in the middle of villages in Africa and India and Latin America. And this group, ITDG, perceived this was actually harmful. For example, taking a factory and tools from a factory in Pittsburgh and putting them in the middle of rural India. So first of all, what they found is that what was most needed in these rural villages was employment. And often these technologies were so highly efficient and automated that instead of employing people, these technologies threw whole villages and regions out of work. So instead of raising up the area, it actually diminished the economy and sent people into cities. And that was their main thing, and they had a couple other aspects of intermediate technology. But their idea was, if the high modern technology of the West doesn't fit these villages, and if their current level of technology might be, quote unquote, too primitive to be effective, what they really need is new technology, but new technology that's more appropriate to their situations. So ITDG created these centers all over the world of technological innovation. But instead of trying to create the biggest and the brightest, the fastest and the easiest and the best, what they tried to do is they went into these communities and tried to figure out what kind of technologies do these communities actually need? What technologies are affordable to them? What technologies would actually help them develop rather than send all their young people into the cities because they're unemployed? And so what they did is they used the best of science and engineering and adapted that knowledge to the contexts. So for example, they created new types of bicycle frames that used material that was cheaper than the iron that was used in the West. They created new versions of cement that was not necessarily cheaper to produce, but that could be produced using local resources and boost the local economy, that kind of thing. Later, E.F. Schumacher, who came up with the term intermediate technology, changed it to appropriate technology, because the question is not rejecting the future or rejecting science. The question is, how do we use the best of science to fit the particular needs of the situation, understanding that a rural village in India is not the same as Pittsburgh, and that kind of thing. Now, what these three precedents all have in common is, first, each had a set of standards by which to judge the new technology. So for the Luddites, it was about livelihood and the dignity of skill and craft. For the Amish, it was about the importance of community and neighborliness and the natural limits of how much land you could own. For the intermediate technology development group, the standards were the health of the particular community and how technology could be fit to meet its economic and cultural needs. Each of these precedents thought communities had the right to choose whether they wanted the new technology. So not only did they have standards by which to evaluate it, they believed communities had almost the democratic right to choose whether they wanted the technology. And if they don't want it, then as a whole community, they can reject it. Now, what's really interesting about that is, in our kind of modern version of democracy, technology choice can be individual. But the idea of groups of people or societies making these choices is a little bit more anathema to us. Finally, each of these groups had means to go about judging and choosing, even if these means differed drastically. So the Luddites literally smashed machines. which is something I don't recommend doing today, and it's something that neither the Amish nor Schumacher was doing. The Amish, on the other hand, being a church community, largely used means of church discipline to adhere to their technology choices. So if someone, actually there are examples today of people choosing to have electricity in their house or telephones or whatever, and the community actually disciplining them for that. Now, I want to talk very briefly about 3 reasons why this is very important to me. The first reason is environmental sustainability. I think there are a lot of questions, and we could just talk about this all night, a lot of questions about evaluating technology based on whether it's sustainable. So one obvious one that a lot of us are aware of would be like carbon emissions, and how our various technologies, especially cars, may actually contribute to climate change. On the other hand, sorry, not on the other hand, but with more detail, I think of Wendell Berry's critique, Why I Won't Use a Computer. And he talks about using electricity produced by mountaintop removal. I want to think about how the earth and creation is embedded in the technologies I use, and how my use of technology might either aid or hinder the possibility of a sustainable society. This matters to me. I think about my friends and about people around the world, the possibility of children. I don't think we're living in a sustainable society right now, and I think the main reason we're not living in a sustainable society is actually the technologies we have chosen to use. Democracy. The more and more I read from these philosophers of technology that I read from, the more I realize democracy is at stake. I buy the arguments that television, telephones, and computers have centralized control and power in our society, and that there's a great imbalance between the power of ordinary citizens and the power of bureaucracies that manage these technologies. And I think that's important, and I think we should reflect on whether that's healthy for our society. Finally, community. This story of the Amish rejecting the threshing machines is really close to my heart. The idea that we might not use a technology because using that technology would erode our community is really significant. Do an hour's worth of research into the loneliness in our society, and I have a really, really big hunch that our epidemic of loneliness, including an epidemic of anxiety and depression, is related to technologies we have chosen to use which have diminished our sense of community. I think there is a lot of wisdom in the Amish recognition that technology can negatively affect community. We might not make the same choices as the Amish, but I think, especially in our churches, we need to think very, very carefully what our choice of technology, what consequences our technology has on our ability to be together and to create belonging. I wanted to talk a little bit about a few ways to put what I've talked about tonight in practice in your personal life or among groups you're a part of. Practice number 1, learn the tradition. There is a great appropriate technology tradition of thinking. Read folks like E.F. Schumacher, Yvonne Illich, Kirkpatrick Sale, Neil Postman, Jacques Ellul, Louis Mumford, Jerry Mander, and others. There's really, really great wisdom in this philosophy and this tradition. I've learned a lot from them, and I think it's really important to learn what they have learned. And the second thing I would advise is that we should study the history of the Luddites, of Amish culture, and the experience of the Intermediate Technology Development Group. each of these groups lived out in real life, in history, these alternative ideas of technology. And I think they're a source of great wisdom, and that we ignore them to our peril. They also give us some ideas of what to put into practice and what not to put into practice. I made a couple jokes about not smashing machines. I think that's a really bad idea. I don't think that can be helpful. So we can learn from the good things they did and from some of their mistakes. A second practice we can put into place is DIY standards. What I mean by this is that we can each create a list of our own standards by which to evaluate technology. I haven't finalized this list, but I do have a list that I'm working on things that matter to me that I think technology can negatively impact, and I'm creating this list of standards and trying to hold myself to it. Some of these standards can be both very personal, but also general proposals. Things that matter for you personally, but also matter for society as a whole. As part of this, you can track your use of technology and compare it to your list of standards in the same way that you might create a budget and then track your spending. Create a technology budget and track your use of technology. Finally, just have community conversations. Find ways to discuss technology with other people. Deliberate community conversations may be the most effective means at changing our culture around technology. I have a particular bias here, but I think the Luddite way of smashing machines or the Amish way of excommunicating people is not going to be effective in our wider culture, our churches, as well as society. I think, on the other hand, asking questions and having the conversation can be quite effective. What about setting aside sermon series, small group discussions, or neighborhood classes where technology and its effects can be discussed? As we end tonight, I want to return to this picture. Jesus with his Zoom Last Supper. I want to ask you a simple question. Do you think Jesus would have actually had the Last Supper with his disciples over Zoom? I think the obvious answer is no, he wouldn't. And I think the fact that it is so obvious also begs the question, how are we using it? I think tonight's a good example of an appropriate use of Zoom. But I do question how often we are meeting over Zoom with people. There are reports, the BBC put a report out a couple weeks ago about Zoom exhaustion. There's something in the nature, the tendency of Zoom to be exhausting when you use it too much. It doesn't replace that kind of sense of personal connectedness that I think is really important. This is a topic that's greatly matters to me, and I'm really curious. Did what I say tonight, did it ring true for you, or are there areas that you really want to push back? Likewise, is there something I said tonight that was unclear? So I want to kind of open it up to discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Isaiah, for your presentation. So I'd like to go to the questions that we have, and this, for those who are attending, this is a chance for you to write some questions using the Q&A tab. So the first question, Isaiah, is how would you connect what you're saying with the anti-vaccination crowd? Should we have more patience for them as they question medical technology? And the questioner says, my present disposition is to think that anti-vaccination messages ought to be rebuked outright. What do you think about that?
That's a good question. I'll maybe be a bit personal here because I think this is an okay forum for that. I found an article today. One of my favorite authors that I mentioned, Ivan Illich, wrote a book about medical technology in the 1970s called Limits to Medicine. And I pretty much hate every time I get a Google alert saying someone is talking about this book, because I don't think it is done well. I think there's a difference between sort of a nuanced, careful critique of technology and conspiracy theory around technology. I honestly haven't really paid a lot of attention to the anti-vax kind of crowd. Generally, I think responding to people with empathy and compassion is important. But in terms of what I'm talking about tonight, I fear that a lot of the activism around stuff like this that gets reported actually takes away legitimacy from some of the stuff I talked about tonight. And so I sometimes get upset because of that. I'm like, well, actually there are critiques that you can make about medical expertise or the use of medical technologies, and I don't think the way you're doing it is quite right. I don't know if that quite answers your question.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, one questioner says, in what ways might you critique, so to turn the critique around, the Luddites or the Amish? And I think you kind of did that a bit in your talk, but maybe if you could go deeper there with critiques you would have of those groups.
Yeah, well, like I said, I would not advise going around smashing machines. I don't think it's a very effective tool. I'm using tool in a different sense there. It's not a very effective strategy. Yeah, and I guess maybe thinking about it, I would imagine that there would be some forms of automating technology or creating mass production that would actually be beneficial. I can't quite think of examples right now. So I think my main critique of the Luddites would be their strategy. In terms of the Amish, I think maybe a more holistic perspective of Amish culture would be, while they do have rationality to a lot of their technology choices, like even most rational people, there are irrational elements, arbitrary kind of authoritarian decision making in those cultures that's unhelpful. I think there is a submission to community authority that is too extreme among the Amish. So there's this ironic thing where this submission to community authority is what allows their culture to be so nuanced with their technology choice, but it also has other negative effects. If that's clear.
Great. Thank you, Isaiah. We have a couple questions actually related to churches and their uses of technologies, and so I will bundle them together. One is actually from Dr. Arnold Sikkema of TW from Vancouver. He says, are you aware of any churches which did thoughtfully consider Zoom prior to their adoption of it? Full disclosure, he says, I am on our church's COVID committee, and we did spend some time considering the pros and cons. And then the other question is related, and that is, your contention is that we very quickly moved into Zoom because most people considered that the only alternative was not to meet at all. So there wasn't necessarily the necessity for that sort of deep engagement that you're advocating. So how would you respond to both of those questions?
So I'll start with the first one, and I just want to make clear that I said most people jumped quickly to Zoom. And so I believe that probably in every church community, there were people who were thinking about it. My main point was just, again, how in our culture, it was just accepted so quickly. And for me personally, I would have made different decisions. And yeah. Sorry, David, can you remind me of the second part of that question?
Yeah, it seemed like this is such a unique event. The pandemic is such a unique event that the only alternative to Zoom was not meeting at all. So of course we're going to be adopting any technology at hand just so that we can build some sort of community.
For sure. I have two responses to that. The first is actually something I forgot to say, which is the exception to most people didn't think about it at all was actually high churches around particularly communion. There was a lot of interesting thinking coming out of Anglican and Catholic and other circles about whether the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper could be practiced over Zoom. And some of that's actually quite interesting. My favorite was actually Michael Curry, who's the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the U.S., has this line where he says it's not about whether it's permissible or impermissible. It's what are we willing for this to signify, which is really fascinating. But in terms of the quickness of response, on the one hand, COVID was an emergency and people needed to think quickly. And often when people need to think quickly or do things quickly, they react out of habit. And so part of what I was saying tonight is we have the habit of accepting new technology. From my perspective, like the way I look at Zoom is Zoom can be functional for certain types of conversation, but I've been trying to avoid using Zoom for like communal gatherings. Instead, actually, between like mid-March and mid-April, I was quite active on my phone, personally calling people and having hour-long conversations, just connecting with friends. So that element of community connectiveness, I found was much easier to do using the technology of a telephone rather than using the technology of Zoom. Now, in terms of church gathering, I would actually welcome like some reflection on what is the meaning of worship? Like, what is the difference between me tuning in to my church filming a worship service on a Sunday and me just listening to worship music on YouTube? Is that the same thing? Is it different somehow? I actually kind of feel like watching a worship service over Zoom is more similar to watching like worship music over YouTube than it is to actually being in a church service. But those are some of my thoughts.
Okay. Thanks, Isaiah. Here's a question of, hey, this is Andrew Wiebe from Kitchener. Thanks, Isaiah. What could be the role of the scientific community in criticizing and discussing technology? Yes.
Mm-hmm. In my original intentions for this presentation, I was going to get into that, but then I sort of went in a different direction. I think the first thing is understanding the difference between small s science as like a practice and a community of practice, and big S science, which is a cultural belief. I talked about the relationship between progress, science, and technology earlier, and I think I'm not a scientist myself. I was trained as a theologian and do community education work now, but I think there's a role for scientists to explain that difference, to explain what science actually is versus some of the mythology that's built around it. A second answer to your question would be related to the Intermediate Technology Development Group. I actually think scientists are well positioned to imagine using their body of knowledge, to use their body of knowledge to create technologies that are appropriate for specific times and places. I can talk about the philosophy of appropriate technology, but scientists can actually put it into practice. I don't have the knowledge to invent these different technologies. All I'm saying is, for people who do have the knowledge, consider who you're making the technology for. A third answer would be consider the ethics of who hires you. I think that's a major thing. I think that scientists should think very carefully, for example, about this is a little bit off to the side, but working for getting a military contract. Do you feel that is ethically appropriate for you to do?
Okay, thanks. This questioner says, how realistic do you suppose it is to think that Western society at large might adopt a more critical approach to new technology, as you are advocating?
That's I think, a very important question and something I think about a lot. I tend not to frame it as, is it realistic, but frame it as, if it were realistic, what conditions would need to be in place? What would need to happen for it to be realistic? I think that one condition that would need to be really important is sort of educational curriculum on some of the stuff we talked about tonight, so people can see an alternative technology perspective that is thoughtful and that is reflective. An opportunity that I see is actually a lot of there's a greater awareness among a lot of people about the negative side effects of social media and internet technology use. And I think that actually could be an avenue to develop greater critical awareness of technology. So as people realize, oh, there are these negative side effects to using Facebook and Twitter and how the internet is organized, I think that could be a pathway to greater knowledge. I don't know. I think thinking about large-scale whole civilizational change is pretty daunting. But I think within our own church communities, I think how can our theological and spiritual traditions interact with technology? And I think that actually, I think there's quite a bit of potential for spiritual reflection on technology if it comes in the right stages.
So this one maybe is somewhat related. It says, hi, this is Ian from Guelph. A lot of the true progress we have made has been due to free time and resources made possible by industrialization. What do you think the balance should be between having faster, automated tasks to leave time for innovation and slowing down for a richer life?
So the question is, what is appropriate values on speed?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I used the Luddites as an example before. They were trying to defend like a traditional culture of craft that would have been lost with the introductions of machines. So I don't think the standard is simply like a slower way of life that we're like valuing as the only thing. I think there are other standards by which we might not choose something that was so fast, right? So I also used the Wendell Berry example about using a computer to write and how he would argue using a computer would actually make him a worse writer. I think that, again, like that's a standard similar to the Luddites. It's a standard of craft that then becomes the way we evaluate the technology. I don't think that quite answers your question, but essentially what I'm saying is, before we even get to that question, let's talk about the different standards we have and then judge each technology in particular. Just as I'm not saying everything should be fast, I'm also not saying everything should be slow. There's something very Aristotle about my presentation today, and I'm talking about that middle way.
The
technology, the mean, things that aren't too fast or too slow, but just right for our context.
Great. Thank you, Isaiah. I am conscious of time, and so I want to honor those who have to step away because we're at 8:30. So I just wanted to let you know, thank you again, Isaiah, that I want to say that the video, we're recording this, and the video will be available on the CSCA YouTube channel, hopefully by Monday if you want to review it to go deeper. I also want to give some thank yous to Isaiah, to Mark McEwen, who's kind of behind the scenes, who's making all of this possible for us, and to Arnold Sikkema and Janet Warren, who were advisors for us in this process, so thank them. If you wouldn't mind, we'd love to get some feedback about this experience for you. So you're welcome to go to our webpage and to email me, or even in the comment section here, just about your experience of this, because as the CSCA and as the ASA, we would like to use more appropriate technologies like this when it seems good to do so. So actually with what I had said from the beginning is that maybe we would end here. Well, certainly we would end here for those who have to go. But that I thought we would end, we turn off our video and audio, and then just go to the chat function. But Isaiah, what do you think actually, because there are several more questions, if actually we answer some more in a few more minutes? Would you be open to that, Isaiah? Do you have the time to answer some more questions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay. So again, thank you for being here if you have to go, and we hope to see you at a future event. But let me go back to our questions, Isaiah. So this comes actually from John Wood of the ASA. He wants you to engage with two scholars. One is Marshall McLuhan, and he says, in Marshall McLuhan's quirky way, he was pointing to the transformative aspect of digital technology that we easily overlook. How might his thought fit into your taxonomy of assumptions if you have engaged with him?
Mm-hmm. I learned about Marshall McLuhan when I was in high school, but haven't really engaged in his thought since. But his key line that the medium is the message, I think, was deeply helpful for me to understand, particularly the first assumption, that it's not just the use of the technology, but the nature of the technology. I actually think McLuhan's idea of the medium being the message can be a really, really good starting point for people to understand this whole tradition. I really think understanding that point allowed me to kind of get what people like Illich or Schumacher or Gerrymander were actually saying.
Great. The second scholar that John Wood mentions is Shane Hipps, who is a pastor who wrote about the hidden power of electronic culture. Hipps is thinking about the same question of why we in the church are oblivious to the epistemological impact that digital technology has on us. He's focused on text versus image. Again, how might his thinking fit into your list of assumptions?
Mm-hmm. I've only briefly engaged Shane Hipps, and that was on something else entirely. But the whole idea of text versus image seems very much like Jacques Ellul's book, I think The Humiliation of the Word, where he talks about text versus image. So I'm sort of assuming that Shane draws on Ellul there. I haven't read Ellul for about 10 years, but I think there's a volume of literature that talks about that difference. I was actually I was doing dishes earlier today, and I was listening to a podcast with an old editor of the Harvard Business Review who wrote a book called In the Shallows, where he looks at the effect of the internet as an intellectual technology. And he was saying a very similar thing, that there's a difference for our brains between reading and using the internet, in the same way there's a difference between reading and using the images. And again, it comes back to that main point. There's a difference between the use of a technology and the nature of the technology. And we should really get away from thinking that the only thing that matters is the use of the technology, because quite clearly, as all these folks are saying, it's also the nature, the tendency of the technology that matters.
Thank you. Before we go to some other questions, I am remiss. I also wanted to add to my thank you list the ASA, who's been instrumental in providing guidance on this process tonight and allowed us to use actually their technology. So thank you to everyone at the ASA for your support. Here's an interesting question. What questions should engineers and designers of new tech be asking as they design? So imagine that you are in that profession. How would you, having these beliefs that you had, how would you go about doing that?
The first thing that comes to mind is economic and ecological limits. So think about the fact that many of the resources that we use in our technologies are non-renewable resources, and also think about the financial or economic costs of what might be engineered. This is maybe idiosyncratic, but I'm quite critical of some of kind of the space exploration kind of ideas, because I think they're economically unfeasible, and there's such an amount of them that I kind of think it's unjust. Other things that engineers can do, I think some of the stuff that we've been talking about tonight is the social, communal, and cultural consequences of technology. So what technology does to people's brains, what it does to their relationships with each other. As like a theologian and educator, I don't have competence to know the technical details of something. So I'd go to ask an engineer to help me with that. I think there's an appropriate openness or humility for engineers to go to people who know more about that area. Like, what might be like the social effects if we introduce this technology? I think that part of the problem is people who are, so I should make a distinction. Of course, I'm not talking about all engineers, but I think particularly people who really believe in invention kind of overgeneralize their expertise. So people like Elon Musk is an engineer. He knows a lot about the technologies he's inventing. I think he is overconfident about the social effects of what he's doing. And so there's a kind of an appropriate confidence of, like, I know this thing, but I don't know this thing. And it would be good to hear what people think about what my technology might do.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. This question says there's also a generational component to technology. Younger generations tend to easily adopt technologies that their predecessors reject. Examples include TV, computer, and cell phones. It seems to me that this is a very powerful effect. Would you agree?
The generational effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And I would actually say it's powerful in a very specific way that I think is dangerous. And I think it's powerful because we all know, like, our parents and grandparents don't use all the same technologies we do. Although I will say my grandmother uses Instagram, and I have never used Instagram.
Does she enjoy it?
I don't know. I think she just looks at pictures of flowers.
Okay.
I think we all are cognizant of that kind of generation gap when it comes to technology, but I think that one of the kind of side effects of that is we often think that's all that technology evaluation amounts to. Old people don't like it, and young people like it too much. And when we think in those terms, I think we move away from like an evaluation of technology. Technology as prudence, because we all see the generation gap or the generation effect. Sorry, when it comes to technology, and we think, well, that's what technology evaluation is.
So maybe we'll make this one our last question, and it's forward-looking. Do you think that obsession with individual autonomy, at least for the most well-off in our society, and on wealth, is in for a reckoning as our lifestyles come into conflict with the finite resources of the earth? So that's the first part. And rather than being only bad or destructive, how do you think this reckoning could be used to restructure our societies to improve our relationship with each other and technology as well?
Mm-hmm. So I think it is coming. So my answer would be yes. I think we are going to recognize we have overstepped our limits and have to come to terms with that. And I would say for the second question that I think this presents an opportunity when more and more people recognize the wider limits that we live in and recognize it as a matter of survival. I think they would be more open to seeing limits as a good thing. I think the story I told earlier today about the Amish and threshing machines and rejecting the threshing machines because it would make us too independent. The interesting thing about that is it's not only a different technology choice, it's a different reason for choosing technology. We often choose technologies because we feel it takes away our limits, where actually there might be wisdom in gaining limits and learning where it might be good to have limits.
Great. Thank you very much, Isaiah. And again, thank you for all of those who participated with us tonight, and have a great weekend. Thanks.